Well, hello, friends. Welcome to our webinar. Mark Roberts and Tod Bolsinger here. We are glad to have you with us in a conversation amongst two old friends talking about nostalgia and how nostalgia can actually be used in leadership. And we're glad that you're here. We have about over 100 and some folks who have signed up for this webinar. It looks like we have about 30 or 35 of us who are going to be joining in this conversation today. We welcome you. We're glad that you're with us. I'm Tod Bolsinger. I'm the Executive Director for the Church Leadership Institute, and I'm here with Mark Roberts, who is the Executive Director for the Third Initiative. We are both part of the De Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Theological Seminary, and we get to be colleagues and friends in this ministry, and you're going to get to have an opportunity to be part of a conversation that started literally in my backyard and is going to continue on to the internet. So we'll set that up in just a moment. For those of you who are here, let me give you just a couple of instructions. You're probably all old familiar experts at these Zoom webinars by now. Let me let you know that we are going to have a significant amount of time for some Q&A. So what we'd like you to do with any questions along the way, that you would put them in the Q&A. Notice there's both a chat function and a Q&A function. Put the questions in the Q&A because that's where we can then curate them in one place. We got 2 or 3 folks on our team who will be watching that to make sure that we don't miss any. So if you've got questions, put it in the Q&A. But I do want to give you a moment to introduce yourselves to each other on chat and let us know a little bit about who's here. If you wouldn't mind using the chat function, so we'll do the Q&A later, but the chat function, just put in where you are coming in from, and if there's a kind of a ministry context or a work context that you're in, or just if you can just tell us just a couple of lines about yourself, that would be helpful. So feel free to put that into the chat, and you'll get to know that I'm actually coming today from Houston, Texas, where I'm doing some work with a church here in Houston, I do a lot of consulting and coaching along the way, and so I'm doing some consulting work in Houston, even though my home base is in Pasadena, California most of the time. So nice to see some folks coming in, pastors and others, some third work folks, some people who do coaching. Terrific. Welcome. Nice to have you all here. It's very, very good to have you. Well, then as that's going in, and as you guys are kind of introducing yourselves on the chat, let me just tell you the context for this conversation about leveraging nostalgia for change. The first thing you need to know about this conversation is that this conversation might have a tinge of nostalgia to it. Mark and I are old friends. We've been friends for 35 years. Mark officiated at my wedding. Mark was my first ministry boss. Mark was there the day my son was born. Mark taught me how to tie a tie and how to change a diaper. So we have this old history, the two of us together. So if it starts feeling like we're telling old stories because we're old friends, it's because we are. We really are. This is part of how our life has unfolded, and it works. And it's one of the great joys of our life that we have also been ministry partners for the better part of those 35 years in different contexts. There was a time when I worked on Mark's staff. There was a time when he worked on mine. There was a time that I went back to work for him. And now we both are colleagues working for Michaela O'Donnell Long. So we have shared both of those friendships and ministry things along the way. But one significant difference between us today is that Mark is spending this time in this very innovative ministry called the Third Initiative, which he's going to tell you about. And I spend my day every day working with mostly church leaders and nonprofit leaders working on leading change. And because of his research, it led us to a difference of opinion about nostalgia. And Mark changed my mind over dinner. It was dinner in my backyard. Mark and Linda, his wife, and Beth, my wife, and I were all having dinner. And I started telling a story about that was kind of dear to me, and it kind of choked me up a little bit. And Mark looked at me and said, "How old are you?" He said, "I'm going to be 58 next month." He goes, "Yeah, you're going to get more nostalgic." And my first thought was, oh, that's such a problem, because I work in helping people lead change in churches. And very often, some of you know, what gets in the way of trying to lead into the future is how some of us start yearning for and loving the past. And then when we get nostalgic, we can get a little bit resistant to new things and changes. And then Mark went on and started talking about how actually the research today is talking about how nostalgia can be helpful. And so about 15 minutes later, I realized I learned something that not only did I not know, but it began to change my mind. And by the next day, I thought, let's have this conversation with a bunch of church leaders, and let's just open it up. So we're not in my backyard, but we are on the internet. But this is the conversation we're going to have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Mark. I'm going to basically tee Mark up. He's going to do some conversation and some insight, go a little deeper than we could do over in my backyard. And then I'm going to come back and we're going to have a conversation with it. So Mark, let's just have you start. We'll have you talk about yourself a bit, the third initiative, and then talk about what third has led you to understand about nostalgia and leadership. And after you've had a chance to do that for a bit, I'll come back and we'll have some conversation. So turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Todd. That's great. And it's fun to do this with you. I want to say something up front, just because I know there's some people listening who are now really uncomfortable. They're worried. And I get that. Todd, you and I have talked about this, so we'll probably circle back to it. But the folks who study nostalgia, and it's usually psychologists, distinguish between two different kinds of nostalgia. One they call historical nostalgia, and that's a kind of a glorifying of the past. That's living in the past. That's being stuck in the past. That's thinking the past was always so much better than the present. That's it, and the psychologists would say that's actually not a good thing for people or for the world. That kind of historical nostalgia, and you do find that a lot in churches, of course. Todd, you and I were part of a church that had an amazing history, and some people were still pretty much living 3 decades earlier, and that's not helpful. And the psychologists would say that historical nostalgia can be a problem. But what they distinguish that from is what they call personal nostalgia. And personal nostalgia is not that kind of dwelling in the past. Personal nostalgia is really a matter of remembering in a particular way things out of your own past and history. And you can certainly remember things about your church and your church growing up or whatever it is. But it's not thinking or believing or feeling that was the best time. It's not wanting everybody to go back there. So it's not at all living in the past, but it is accessing the past. It's revisiting the past. And we'll say a little bit about that. So I just wanted to say that to folks who are out there thinking, oh man, I'm really worried now. Because usually when I talk about nostalgia at Christian groups, I'm going to get people quoting me, about, like Paul pressing on, not looking back. And there are passages in scripture, God's going to do a new thing. And they're worried that somehow this is not that. And let me just reassure people. Okay, now back to it. How I got into this thing. So I was for 6 years the executive director at the De Pree Center at Fuller, which is focused mainly upon helping marketplace leaders. We serve church leaders, but we serve church leaders so they can really serve the people in their congregations better. And from the De Pree Center side, Todd, you're doing a particular work in helping with change leadership, but ultimately that's going to matter to the people in the pews or the chairs or wherever they're sitting now, at home on their couches watching on TV. So I'm in this executive director role, and I keep meeting with people in their late 50s, early 60s, who are marketplace leaders, trying to live their faith in their workplace, but they keep saying to me something like, I know I'm going to have to retire at some point, and I don't feel like I'm done making a difference with my life, but I got to get out of the way of the people I'm mentoring, and I don't even know how to think about retirement. My church isn't helpful at all. You guys ought to do something. And so hearing that, literally at least a couple dozen times, I'd sort of say, well, if we ever got some money to do something with this, we could. And along the way, a very generous couple came along and said, well, yeah, I think we could help you with this. And so we got into this work. Our third initiative is really focused on helping people in the third of life, which is roughly late 50s and on, helping people in the third of life flourish, by which we mean live fully or abundantly, the abundant life, and live fruitfully, make a difference in the world. Okay, so that kind of frames up how I got into this work. Now, I'm not an expert in gerontology or some of the disciplines. I'm a New Testament scholar, done a lot with leadership and faith work. So I figured I got to get into this and start digging into the literature. So the first book I read, relevant to third book by a man named John Medina, called Brain Rules for Aging Well. John is a brain scientist. He is a molecular biologist and brain scientist. He's written other books on the brain, and he has an amazing ability to take hardcore, utterly impenetrable science and make it available to normal readers. Plus, I know John as a friend. He's also a fine Christian. So I'm going to start with John's Brain Rules for Aging Well. And he begins his book by telling a story that, as we say, blew my socks off. And I'll summarize the story in this way. So there was a psychology professor at Harvard who now 40 years ago designed an experiment. She took several older men who were not doing very well, men well into their 70s or beyond, who are not healthy, either mentally or physically. And she found a monastery up in New Hampshire, and she created in that place a reality that was of an earlier time. So this was 1981, this experiment. She created this 1959 experience, 1959 music, news, everything. The idea was, what will happen to these people if they sort of go back in time, as it were? So before these men actually get to the experiment, they do all these tests, physical tests, mental tests, everything they can think of to test them. And then they give them this week kind of going back in time. And then when it's over, they do all the measurements again. Well, partly they didn't even have to measure some of it, because most of these men were not physically very well and had a hard time walking into the monastery. On the way out to go home, some of the research assistants were playing touch football, and the men got involved with them playing touch football. And these are people who could hardly walk. Now they're playing touch football. And then, of course, they did all the tests, the mental tests and physical tests, and discovered that this 1 week of this immersive nostalgia experience did great things for their brains and for their body. This is pretty hardcore kind of stuff. The book, and I think, yeah, it's over in, Brain Rules is over there for, yes, thank you. The book on this whole experiment is called Counterclockwise by Ellen Langer, Counterclockwise. But that's how John Medina gets into this thing. And I'm like, whoa, I've never heard anything like this. And if it wasn't John Medina, and if it wasn't a Harvard, I think this is just the quackery you find on the internet. But no, it had to take it more seriously. So as I dug into the book, John puts a whole lot more research together. And I discovered there actually are serious scientific people, usually psychology and professors of psychology, who are really studying this nostalgia stuff. And I learned a lot about it. I'll be really brief. And if you want more, by the way, there is actually a group at the University of Southampton in England. They're called the Nostalgia Group, a bunch of psychology grad students and professors who study nostalgia. And if you Google on Nostalgia Group Southampton, you'll get there, and they got a lot of stuff. So you'll see what they're doing and the kind of the seriousness about this. But here's kind of the short story of nostalgia that I've learned. So the word nostalgia actually was coined in 1688 by a Swiss doctor who was studying a particular phenomenon of people who had left Switzerland and had a longing for it. Like, yeah, no duh. Anyway, but he thought this was not a good thing. He invented the word nostalgia, and that comes actually from the Greek word nostos, which is homecoming, and algia or algos, which is pain. And so in his view, nostalgia was a painful kind of thing. And he thought it was a very unhealthy kind of thing. He summarized that it might actually have been that these Swiss soldiers had grown up hearing the clanging of cowbells so much it messed up their brain. I'm not kidding. That's seriously there. So he started off really with a very negative view of nostalgia, and that continued on for centuries among professionals, doctors, people studying this, psychologists. Like, this isn't good. This is living in the past. This is unhealthy. We got to get people out of this thing. And that really was the dominant view well into the last century. And of course, this was also often replicated and supported in the church. I'm sure you've heard or given sermons about not living in the past. I know I have. And we're not saying you should live in the past, but you get my point. That in fact, there was a writer, I did a little search, there's a Christian writer from a responsible website that recently wrote that nostalgia is the enemy of the gospel. So, okay, there you go. But what happened in the last, say, 30-ish years is, especially as psychologists and researchers were working with older adults who were into nostalgia, they began to see things that seemed positive about that. And so these are people who want to study stuff. So they start studying what's going on here. Why is it that this older person who has all these nostalgic episodes, it actually seems to be doing better and thriving, and this is not what we thought nostalgia was about and featured. And so the folk over at University of Southampton and a number of other professors have really dug into this whole nostalgia thing and what they've discovered. Now, again, remember, there is a kind of nostalgia that they will call historical nostalgia. It's not a good thing to go back and to glorify and romanticize the past and get stuck there. That's not a good thing. Personal nostalgia, once again, is a different kind of thing. It is a personal thing. So it sometimes they'll define it as a sentimental longing for one's past. Another one defines it as a bittersweet yearning for the past. Now, I'm guessing that most of you, even if you're young, because nostalgia is not just for older folk, you understand that bittersweet longing if you've had a memory of some precious time in your life, and the memory is so sweet, but there's this bittersweet because you realize you can't ever go back there. I mean, some of you, if you're parents, and especially if your kids are grown, you'll see a picture of you holding your baby, and it's like you're filled with joy, but there's some sadness too, because you realize you can't go back. And by the way, part of personal nostalgia is understanding you can't go back. So it's not trying to go back or just living there, but it's this bittersweet yearning for the past. And so it comes with sort of joy and sadness. Now, by the way, if we had more time, I'm not going to do it now, but you can go through many of the Psalms do this. There's like great memories of the past and then sadness and yearning for it. It's in the Psalms. I wonder sometimes, that line in the Gospels where it says, and Mary treasured all these things in her heart. Well, I wonder what it was like for Mary to treasure all those things in her heart, say 50 years later. Don't you think she would have been so full of the joy of what it was like to be with Jesus when he was little? And then this longing, see, and I think most of us get that. So anyway, the folks that study nostalgia, they find that it can actually be very helpful for people in a number of ways. And basically how they test it is they create, the thing that Ellen Langer did was quite involved. They don't tend to do things that involved, but they tend to do experiments where you put people in an immersive environment that fosters nostalgia. Music is big on this, right? So if you're, whatever age you are, if you play the music that you loved when you were a late teenager, chances are you're going to have this nostalgic memory of, oh, I remember hearing that song, or I remember the girlfriend that I danced with when we did that. And, you sort of go back to this nostalgic moment. And then they just study what happens with people who have these experiences. But here's some of what they found. That people who experience nostalgia have what they call increasing social connectedness. That is, they have a stronger sense of belonging and acceptance in the present day. They feel more connected, more related to people than those who don't have that experience. That's one thing. Second thing is what they call augmented self-continuity. And this makes a lot of sense when you think of it. that people sort of see themselves as an ongoing human being, not just in this moment, but they kind of see themselves in terms of their longer life. And that actually does good things for one's psychological well-being and one's brain, actually. Now, here's one of the things I find most fascinating about these nostalgia exercises. And again, these are things that have been replicated by scientists over and over. So it's not just some guy out there on the internet, making stuff up. That people who go through a nostalgic experience have what they say is a strengthened motivation to pursue one's most important goal. In other words, when people go back and remember the past, something happens in their brains that helps them to focus on what matters most in the present. Now, that is really interesting. And it's almost so contrary to what we might think would be the case. And so, I mean, there are many other demonstrated benefits of nostalgia. So going back to John Medina, and then I'll stop, and then Tod, we can start talking. We can be in conversation with others too. So John Medina, after laying out all this stuff, he recommends that people create some space in their house that's like a nostalgia space. And he would say, get the music you loved when you were younger. Pull out your high school, your college yearbook. Find books you used to read that you loved when you were younger. Smells are huge this way, by the way. Smells are very evocative of things from the past. So, whatever that might be for you. And he says, allow yourselves occasionally just to indulge. Now, don't sit there all day. Don't get stuck there. That's not what anybody's recommending. But it's so different from what we tend to think is going to be healthy and right. Because it feels like, wait a minute, you're saying you should go back into your past and like relive stuff? Yeah. And so I actually have a quasi place like that in my house where I have some Hardy Boy books. I used to love reading Hardy Boy books. I'll every now and pull them off the shelf and I'll read part of one or something. It's fun. I've got the photo albums from our family. I have access to music. I've been buying music that I loved when I was about 20. And I just, and it's kind of fun, but there's also a bittersweetness to it. And that's the part of the nostalgia piece that you're yearning for it, you're longing for it. You can't go there anymore. And yet it was so good. Now you can see, and the researchers acknowledge there's danger there. You get stuck there. If any of your Harry Potter fans, it's a little bit like the Mirror of Erised, only, you go back and look at your past and you could just get stuck. Don't want that to happen. But you can, according to the research, that this can actually help your brain to feel more connected to people, more connected to your own past. It can actually help you focus on the thing or things that matter most in your life now, which is, it's just kind of amazing. So Tod, I'm going to stop there. I've been yammering on for quite a while.
Well, okay, so this is exactly the conversation we were having that got me so excited about this, because so it seems to me, Mark, the first thing that has to happen is we've got to be able to identify this difference between historical and personal nostalgia, and in some ways help people not be stuck in historical and move to personal, because this personal nostalgia has actually all these really positive things, right? Belonging and acceptance, a sense of seeing your life as something bigger, augmented self-continuity, being able to focus even more on the present. Those are good things. So what's the first thing we can think about? I just want, now this is the place, you and I were both pastors. So think of how many people in our congregations are stuck in historical nostalgia. And the church is almost a place that feels like you're supposed to be stuck, right? We're supposed to hold on to these things. How do we talk about this, and how do we help people make this shift from historical nostalgia to personal nostalgia? What are some of the things we can do?
Well, that's a great question. And I've actually been trying some of that because, Tod, as you know, I'm still involved in the First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood, where I grew up. You and I were on staff there together, and then I was away for a lot of years, and now I'm back. And that church is in a very significant interim period. And it's also a church that was once the largest Presbyterian church in the country, and now it's nowhere near that. And so it's easy for folks to do historical nostalgia. And so one pastoral approach is just to almost to criticize that and never to talk about the past. That's one, right? It's like we got to move on and press on in Christ, and and that misses some key things. But the nostalgia research would say we don't want people to get stuck in the past, but it's really okay and healthy for them to remember their experiences from the past and enjoy them in a kind of bittersweet way. But then what do we do as in our pastoral work with people? And I've been preaching there a lot, so I've been thinking about it. Well, one is you turn it to gratitude. Okay, this is really important, right? You could stay stuck in my own feelings, but to turn stuff to gratitude. I tried this actually at a retreat. I was leading a retreat for some third folk, older men, most in their 70s. And I had them do a nostalgia exercise on their own. But then when the stuff came out, I encouraged them just to thank God for those experiences. And I had literally some of these highly professional, successful men who are very, wired up, like crying hard because for the first time in their life, one guy, for the first time in his life, he was thanking God for his 4th grade teacher who had made such a difference in his life. So that's one way, by gratitude. Another way is by acknowledging the feelings, the bittersweetness for people. Todd, as you know, one of the big things we did at our church in Hollywood in the late 60s, early 70s, there was this thing called the Salt Company. It was a big deal. And it was reaching out to the street people in the streets of Hollywood, or there are many, hippies and those sort of folk. And it was really an amazing thing that the church did. Now, here again, it would be easy to completely ignore it. We don't want people to get stuck. That's one pastoral response. Another response from some people would be just to live there forever and never leave and say, oh man, that was it. And that, the glory days are gone. What the church has been doing is actually bringing back things, Salt Company thing, having a reunion of the band that sang, showing a documentary that one of the people in the church made. Okay, so now you're kind of in this risky place. You could get stuck in the past, or you as a leader can appropriate that. And so when I've been preaching in and around those times, I'm really trying to connect in with what it was that people were feeling then and feeling now. And again, I think gratitude is huge in this. To be grateful for what God did. And then, of course, in our pastoral role, to begin to think, what would it be like for God to do that sort of thing now, given who we are? What does that mean for us to kind of reclaim being that kind of church that so saw the need in our community, we were going for it? And so I just think that's one way to gratitude, but then also bringing in, but see, not just pushing it away, right? Because you push it away and then it's not only people going to be angry, it's the redemptive and renewing part of this nostalgic experience they won't have.
Well, part of what strikes me about it, Mark, and I just want to say to those of you who are in the webinar, feel free to start putting your questions in the chat. The Q&A, please put in the Q&A. We've got 2 in there already, and I've already begun to look at them, and we'll be coming to those in a second, but as you have different questions. It seems to me one of the parts of the overlap that you and I talked about is that so much about leading change is actually leading people with empathy, right? We tend to think that change leaders are taskmasters, like here's the change, here's the strategy, take the hill. And the truth is, because you're taking people who are going to have to go through their own transformation, they're going to experience loss as you go through change, you have to lead with empathy. And here's a way of actually even helping people embrace in that kind of, you talked about the bitter sweetness of, hey, there were these things that were really beautiful for us, and we want to give thanks to God for them. and we're going to need to move beyond them. Like I think about that 70-year-old who thought about his fourth grade teacher. I don't think he wants to go back to the fourth grade, but he can be grateful today for that person in his life. This is like an emotional intelligence skill that those of us who are leaders need to pay more attention to, right? Is it something we need to develop in terms of being sensitive to that?
Yeah. And, to be sure. And not to be afraid of it. I think it's easy to be afraid of it. The fear would be, we're opening up a Pandora's box and now everybody's just going to live in the past and they're never going to want to change. And I get that. And there will be some people who will get pretty stuck. But I really have found, and I found recently in my work with this church that has had this great history, that they don't want to be stuck, but it means a lot to them to have their experiences validated, recognized. I mean, the empathy thing you say, and I can just imagine myself as a younger pastor being afraid of asking questions like, so tell me what that was really like for you. Tell me more about that. How'd that feel? And because fearing that, they'll get stuck in the past, or, the president is good. And so I think what you've said about empathy is an important piece. But and part of it then is it really involves helping individuals, but it also involves helping churches to see themselves in terms of the connectedness they talked about, and then the continuity over time. That unless you're planning a church brand new, I mean, there's going to be a history there, and that history is important and needs to be not denied or shoved down, but it needs to be valued. The good needs to be given to the Lord. There may be bad someplace too that needs to be confessed, and there's a need for repentance. But that's not the whole point, of course, right? It's right. So that we can have a clearer sense of who we are now, where God is calling us, and so that we can be more integrated people, both individually and as a church. Just a lot about integration.
Yeah. So let me go to some of the questions here. A couple of people have made some connections. So let's just make sure, let's get really clear on this personal nostalgia versus historical nostalgia. This is a kind of a light bulb moment. One person said, to confirm, personal nostalgia involves experiences in which we had agency versus events that were just occurring around us. What is it that makes
agency or personal involvement? So the agency could be I can remember being rocked to sleep by my mother. Well, I wasn't really an agent. She was the agent, but that's a very personal. So it's personal engagement, I think, would be better, as opposed to, I remember how awesome it was when we landed on the moon. Now, that could really be something we're nostalgic about if that meant a lot to us, but especially if it was a shared experience. Yeah. So what I, in fact, remember about the moon landing was sitting around a radio with my family. Now, that's a really sweet experience. So it is something in which we have been, it's our personal experience. And often the nostalgic people will say it often has to do with either important events or important people. And it can be important events and people together. So, I mean, one of the things I'm most nostalgic about is things having to do with Christmas, right? And it's because it's events and people. It's all of the memory of, the things we did, especially when I was a kid and when my children were young. But then it's so relational. So but I'm not nostalgic about, I don't know, the Hollywood Christmas parade that I never saw.
Mm-hmm. So Mark, let's use this even be even more concrete in terms of the how about this. Somebody mentioned when you talked about nostalgia spaces, one of the people here, Rick Peterson, you talked about memorial stones, part of that whole notion of Ebenezer's that are set up in the scriptures. There is a lot of conversation in the Hebrew scriptures, particularly about looking back. Abraham Joshua Heschel said that the scriptures teach us to remember, right? So how would we do that in a good way? So let's just think about a pastor, particularly a pastor or an organizational leader or someone who is trying to move people who are resistant to moving because they are stuck in historical nostalgia. how do we think about setting up a memorial stone or a nostalgia space, understanding that we are going to ask them to move into the future? Like,
Well, I may have this story wrong, Todd, but when you did a major rebuilding project down in San Clemente, didn't you use some of the things that had been there before, some of the physical things?
Yeah, actually, we did two things. We had to tear down our chapel.
Right.
And what we did is the first thing we did is we asked a construction company to come in and take out the stained glass windows out of the chapel and stored them for 18 months.
Oh.
I hadn't thought about this, Mark, so you raised it. And the other thing we did is we took pictures of the inside of the chapel. And when they rebuilt a brand new chapel, we had them replicate the gables that were in the wood so that it looked the same. And we put in the stained glass windows. And so this chapel that had been in the center of our campus was now going to be a new chapel on the side of our campus. So we literally tore down the place where people like got baptized and got married. And we did a service of gratitude. We invited everybody who'd ever been baptized or had ever been married in that service place, or had ever had a funeral or of a loved one in there, to come to a service. And we took a picture of everybody who'd ever been married there. We took a picture. We actually had this whole experience of giving thanks to God for what happened in that space. And then we invited all those people back to the opening of the new chapel, where they walked in, saw the old stained glass windows, saw the gables that looked the same, and yet the space was really different. So we kind
That's
of
great. People are going to think we set that up, Todd. And
I
you know, we didn't.
I hadn't thought
We've
about
never
that.
talked about that.
Yeah.
But please, that's such a great example, because, and I'm sure you had some people who were not happy that you were going to tear down the chapel and, stuff like that.
No.
But you didn't just say, hey, sorry, pal, we're doing something new. And so you made an effort to celebrate, to remember, to reframe, to include, to thank God for. I mean, churches don't often know what to do about this, right? How do we remember our corporate past in a way that is that doesn't get us stuck, but celebrates what God has done? The one place we often do this, I think, is in memorial services, where we'll celebrate the life of a person in the church, but we're not. And there is a bittersweetness about that. You remember experiences we had with somebody who is gone, and yet what usually comes out of that isn't, okay, we're going back to 1960 so I can be with Anna Kerr again. We're more like we feel bonded. We feel connected. I think that's another of the things that happens when people share nostalgia. That was there. I mean, just about 4 days ago is an article in the New York Times about sort of nostalgia, and the point of that article was the comfort of nostalgia, that it sort of is a retreat from this reality of the world that's a hard world, and we connect with people through that experience. I mean, those are true. The writer didn't really go into some of the greater depth that can come from nostalgia, and that's okay. But there is a sharing of it that can be a good thing. And I think as we're trying to lead change, we could be afraid of the past, and so we don't capitalize it. I mean, again, going back to the Hollywood Press example, Todd, as you know, we were part of the church in which once Henrietta Mears was a giant, and she, for someone in this webinar will know that it was a huge name, hugely influential, and there were some who had been in leadership who were really bugged by how much people talked about Henrietta Mears. And then there were people like you and me that thought, well, I'm going to be, even though I never met her, I'm going to become an expert in Henrietta Mears. I'm going to discover how to use her legacy to lead us forward. And so rather than like denying the past or even, finding negative things to say about it, we were using it to help people move forward. And I think we both sat at our desk too, which was kind of cool.
Right. We both had our job. We both had our desk. And they dedicated a building to her in the first month I had her job,
Yeah.
which was a little daunting, actually. So,
Yeah.
okay. So I got actually, Mark, now we have several questions.
All
So
right,
I'm going
good.
to go
Cool.
through several of them.
Awesome.
So we'll need some, you and I'll need to give some more brief answers. Somebody asked, how does this approach tap into a practice of inner healing prayer, inviting Jesus into the point of pain and asking him to heal it? Have you thought about it?
Well, to be sure, nostalgia, although nostalgia tends to go back to positive things, it can also go back to negative and painful things. And here again, as those are recalled and re-experienced, it really is an opportunity for healing. It's an opportunity. So I had an experience recently like that I won't go into here because I'll start bawling and then that wouldn't be helpful. But I remembered some pain from my junior high years I had never thought of. And I just poured out my heart to God. 50 years later? That was really powerful and important for me. It was a healing thing for me. So realizing, and this also, it's pretty great to know that Jesus is present always and everywhere, right? So, in a sense, Jesus could be present with that hurt little boy. So I just think as these things get opened up, there is that opportunity. And obviously, sometimes we need to get some help with this, to talk with folk who can guide us through it.
So one person actually did this anonymously, which I totally understand. How do we help churches move beyond a past that was closed to those who are different, a culture that was tribal, they still may believe was okay, and healthy the way things are? I mean, this is another part of the pain, is when people start being nostalgic for the past, there are others who have a sense of, yeah, I don't have those memories because I was excluded from that. There's parts of our past. How do we help? This feels like the most painful part.
Yes, sure. If all we did was remember the good things, that would be inadequate, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, what the nostalgia piece encourages us to do is to be open to those memories and to the past and to take it seriously. Because again, what a lot of privileged Christians want to do today is say, okay, look, that was bad, but we just got to press on. Let's move on. Not let's reflect on what this past has meant in our church life. And so, you actually sent me this link to this book by Daniel Pink on regret. It was fascinating. I just scanned it. I haven't read the whole thing. But again, part of what he's arguing is that there is good in going back through our life and dealing with our regrets. And again, it's the willingness to deal with what's real in our lives that's bringing continuity and an openness to growth.
That's good. That's really, really good. I appreciate that. There is some, so when we start talking about nostalgia, I think one of the things that makes it personal is actually by making it completely personal. Where I think historical nostalgia can almost be a caricature. Those were the good old days, my friends. I thought they'd never end, right? Where personal nostalgia actually pays attention. I mean, you use the example of parenting. Like, we love being parents. So we raised our kids together. They know each other well. But I love them as adults and I long for their past, but I'm also really aware of there were some sleepless nights and things we couldn't do and things that were hard and painful in there too. Personal nostalgia makes us make it a more full-orbed and more real and more honest in one sense, right?
There is research on the ways in which remembering hard things from the past can be a part of a process of healing for people. And again, mostly, folk would say, if that stuff is just jammed down and hidden and denied, that's not going to be a path of healing, either for an individual or for an organization or for a church.
Yeah. One person asked even more specifically, can you speak to how this may work in community with friends or small groups? How do we think about a small group or people in community, people in their neighborhoods, leveraging nostalgia in positive ways? I think that's a really interesting thing.
Well, It is an interesting thing. And some of this actually happens, right? As friends get together and they start talking about, what it was like when we were in college, and so that happens. But I think we can encourage that kind of conversation. Uh, and we might not do so if we didn't realize that there's actual benefit in it as people share different memories. See, here again, one of the places we do this, at least in my experience, is in memorial services. And we get together and we talk about people. And there's a sweetness in the sharing of the memory. I think we could encourage more of that kind of thing. And again, not with respect to church and church leadership and all that, but just in terms of encouraging our people to share some of their lives together. So you could, you're on a retreat with some of your people, some of your elders. And one of the questions is talk about, the teacher in your elementary school who made the most difference in your life and what that meant to you. And then we'll all thank God for it. I mean, that's just the example like the one I did. But I think there's opportunity there to do some new things.
Well, and what some of the parts where this connects, somebody in the chat mentioned the idea of appreciative inquiry. Some of the work that we do and that I do in leading change, people are always surprised that when my little company is asked to come in and do some work on bringing change, the first thing we do is we ask people to tell stories of the past.
Yeah.
And the reason for telling the stories is as they, and the way we described it, one of our friends says, you've got to tell stories that make you pat your heart. Don't tell stories about, in 1947, we had a budget that was really high. Tell stories about what makes you choke up. Because what you're actually getting to are the things that are most valuable about this community. And what you're actually identifying are our values, the things that we value enough to want to go forward. Now, they might have to change, but we're going to try to carry that forward. It might be the wine that has to go in a new wineskin. It might have to adapt, but there's something about that value that goes forward. And there's something about what you're saying about personal nostalgia is that it gets us really clear on what we value and that we are valuable. That sense of belonging, like my story matters, and I'm part of a continuity of something bigger than me, and that I have this fuel that can go into the future because I've had this experience in the past, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's just so interesting. To me, it's somewhat counterintuitive to think that if I, sit in my little spot and read some Hardy Boy books and listen to Gordon Lightfoot and whatever else, that's actually going to help me be more connected to the people in my life now.
Yeah.
But the research would say that that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, so I can imagine, so going back, I spend my life in the church world. So I can imagine a church that's going to take on a really new change. We're going to reach neighbors, and the neighborhood around us has changed dramatically. So the neighbors aren't going to look like us. It's going to be harder. It's going to be, but to say to the folks who've been the faithful core, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to create spaces for you to give thanks to God for the past, nostalgia spaces, memorial spaces.
Yeah.
Hymn sings, I can imagine a group of your friends all getting together, listening to, songs from the Jesus People movement. right.
Well, that's what my church has done.
Yeah.
Several times. And I think it has been led in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. So it isn't just, wow, we used to be great, now we suck, isn't this awful, boy. It's more, God has been at work among us in surprising ways, and God is still at work, and wonder what comes next. And that's part of the pastors and lay leader in churches, but that's part of the leadership of a church, framing things to help people grow.
Yeah. So, okay, so a lot of the questions now also in the chat are, I think people are tracking with you, Mark. And I think and actually there's already people saying, hey, I want to make sure I get this stuff for later. But we're all holding on to this piece that says, and I'm going to say it bluntly on behalf of all of us who have been there. Okay, Mark, but how do we keep these folks not getting stuck there? right? Like you're basically asking us to trust that if we go there, they're not going to get stuck there. Because some of us, anybody who's ever done youth ministry in the last 20 years knows someone can remember when, we took 3 buses full of kids to camp, right? Or something like that.
I remember, Todd, you were in my college group. One year we did an event. I can't remember what we called it. Just call it Happy Event. Next year, we're going to do something different. And people are like, why aren't we doing Happy Event? We always do Happy Event. These are college kids.
Right.
Well, some people aren't going to be able to move on.
Okay.
I mean,
So it's
they're
acknowledging that it's
they're
not,
just going to say, and
they're gonna miss out. Yeah.
and we can love them and probably listen more than we would like to where they are, and just love them. But I think with others, see, I think our fear says, okay, I mean, I'm just thinking about someone you and I both know, Todd, who is very much oriented toward historical nostalgia. And it's easy to not want to listen to her.
Yeah.
It's really easy to not want to listen. She's kind of got an attitude sometimes. And over the years, maybe because I'm getting older, I've been able to listen to her more. And that makes a difference. It can be threatening because, it can feel like she's stuck in the past. But I do think one of the things we can do is really listen, and listen not just to the facts, but what does this mean to this person? What did it mean to her to feel connected the way she did? What did it mean to her to worship in a way that really resonated with her soul? I mean, what did that mean? And I think that's one way. The interesting thing, partly I want to respond to folk who are asking this. I think those are great questions. And to my knowledge, nobody has ever actually studied this stuff, this particular connection we're making here. So I'm kind of hoping that somewhere in the world, one of our colleagues at the School of Psychology at Fuller or something decided, hey, wouldn't it be interesting to take all this nostalgia stuff and think about how it works in church leadership and change? That would be somebody's got a D-Min thesis there, by the way, if you're looking for something to do here with Todd.
Yeah. Okay, Mark. So we're gonna need to wrap up in a bit, but I want to go back and hit a couple of highlights and then ask you one final question here. And I thank you for all of you who put questions into the Q&A. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them, but it was really great. You said, and in one sense, when you help people have personal nostalgia, they have a sense of belonging and acceptance. They have a sense of that their life is got a continuity, that they're part of something bigger that's beyond themselves, and that it also helps them focus on what matters in the present today. Those are like three big reasons why. So if someone wanted to start this, like right now, where would you have them start? What would you have them say? Okay, I know I'm bringing change, but I want these folks who I love, who are part of this church, who are resistant, to feel belonging, to feel like they matter in something bigger, to feel like I want them to start focusing on the present. Where would you start? Where would you have them start?
Well, one of the things we could all do is just do some of this ourselves and discover more of what happened. And again, I think some people are really wired for this and some aren't. Like, I'm really wired for this. My wife, not as much. It's just different wiring. But we could, and you say, well, what would that mean? It would mean set aside a half hour sometime and go pull, the songs you loved when you were 20 and, whatever, and just let yourself just see what happens. Now, what I'm saying beyond the nostalgia folk is then as good things come up, just tell the Lord, thank you. Thank you for that gift. Just so we're experiencing, I think that's part of it. Because then that also might open up ways to talk about that with people that would be helpful. But the next thing I would say is listen and ask questions. I mean, the inquiry piece. I mean, listen and ask questions. So rather than with this particular individual, I was saying that can get stuck in the past, rather than just wishing she would shut up, I could say, tell me more of what that was like for you. And try to not be threatened by it, right? I mean, try to just, and really so enter into that experience. And then in terms of what you can do organizationally in the church, I mean, I think appropriate celebrations of things from the past can be helpful, but that's really going to vary with different communities. And there may be times when different communities need to do the flip side of the thing, and that is to acknowledge things about our past that were not so good. And now we need to even though we're not living there today, we need to own some of that and repent some of that. But I think there's a good opportunity to celebrate and share and thank God for stuff. And then the leader can help say, okay, so that kind of God working in that kind of church, what's that going to look like now?
So friends, let me just say that if you're really interested in this work, I really encourage you to follow Mark's work in the Third Initiative. I have found in the work I do in leading change that many of our congregations have come back and said, hey, now that we know we're needing to bring change to a new generation, can we get help? And we have turned them to Mark and to the Third Initiative as the consultants on this particular area. So I encourage you to take advantage of that and to do so. And for those of you who just need help with your churches in the middle of these processes, no, look at me. I'm getting help from Mark so that we can serve you better too. We do a lot of things around figuring out how to take the very, very best pieces of our past into our future. We often say that adaptive and enduring change is the healthiest adaptation of your core DNA, your deepest values. So hopefully there's some value from this conversation. There was lots of energy. For those of you who are signed up for this link, that you'll make it available to you. We also are going to give you some links to connect to us. The CLI podcast, Spiritual Life and Leadership, is going to feature this. I'm going to do a follow-up conversation. So those resources will be available. And we just hope that this has been a helpful hour to you and has served you. And Mark, thanks again for doing this. This will be another one of our memories that we'll share.
I know. Remember, Todd, when we did that webinar when we were young?
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Friends, thanks for being here. Bless you all.
Thanks.